Before I begin, I would like to make two preliminary points. Firstly is that of all the topics at Yale that I've discussed with other students, there has never been one more divisive than education policy. Education policy is extremely complicated, and it involves students from our entire country, from every city and state. And for that reason, I'm not going to stand here as an 18-year-old college student and say that I have an answer and try and dispute Professor Brittain and his fine speech and his more years of experience in the topic than I have been alive. However, I do want to make the general point that I do not think that mandatory school integration, mandatory institution of diversity in schools is the correct way to go about solving problems. And the second point that I wanted to make was that Dr. Brittain and I probably agree on the end goal. The end goal is that we want all students, regardless of race or regardless of ethnicity, religion, gender, or anything else, to have an equal opportunity to education. And the end goal is also that I believe we both believe that diversity is extremely important in education. Like Dr. Brittain said, there's many statistics to prove this. Yale rightfully touts how diverse its student body is, and I believe that does help a lot in students learning more about other communities and other ways of living. However, I believe that if we do not solve the underlying issue, which is prejudice, integrating schools will do nothing but basically put a veil over the original issue. And the reason I think this is that students are only in school about 8 hours, plus extracurriculars. However, they return to their original communities. And if, as we're arguing, that there is prejudice in these original communities, they're returning to these original communities at the end of the school day, where their parents, if they're prejudiced, and their neighbors and anyone else around them will have the same opinion. So if we integrate these schools mandatorily, as opposed to voluntarily, what will happen is the parents of the students who are forced into these mandatorily integrated schools, into these school districts that they may have not wanted their students to go in, will have even greater animosity for groups that they don't understand and aren't around in the first place. And if we do not solve the underlying prejudice first, then I believe that this will just lead to more animosity. And I'm not saying that all schools that are underprivileged are specifically underprivileged due to the fact that the people who are making decisions on where resources go are specifically prejudiced against a certain community that goes to a certain school. But I am saying that in these cases, integrating these schools will not specifically fix the underlying prejudice. And I'll give an example. I'm from Mississippi. My family is from Crystal Springs, Mississippi, which is a city known locally for very poor race relations in a state known to have the worst race relations. So after Brown versus Board of Education, after the schools were integrated, the white families, instead of agreeing with this integration, moved their children into private schools like the Crystal Springs Academy, specifically to avoid the problems of integration. And while and there's also, even today, even if parents do not move their students into private schools like this, they will also, if the prejudice is still in the background, the students will still be prejudiced. There will still be prejudice against the students in the form of the way teachers react to the students. And for this reason, I believe that before we integrate schools in this manner, and I do not have an answer to this either, I do not claim to have a great answer to this, but I believe that we should first solve the underlying prejudice. And without you.
Is there a second document speech you need for me? First speech.
Madam Speaker. Okay, so in the 1980s, 80s and 90s as school districts across the country were turning away from the mandatory court integration schemes, a new era of school reform arose. And this was sort of a partnership by powerful philanthropists, so the Gates Foundation, the Walden Family Foundation, Betsy DeVos, and bipartisan majorities, right? So Democrats and Republicans. And we saw a turn towards accountability, zero tolerance, discipline, and charter schools and school vouchers, so school choice, as sort of replacements for mandatory school integration. So what's the deal with that? It's basically something that the previous speaker gestured to, which is that white parents had proved so extremely resistant to school integration, and it was so politically unpopular that politicians sort of threw up their hands and they were like, okay, well, we're just not going to do this anymore. We're just going to try to make the high poverty schools in communities of color better, and we can just make that, we can just fix educational inequality that way by making those schools better. So that policy has failed spectacularly. No child left behind, it's designed to, oh, sorry, I forgot to say one more thing. During the era of mandatory school integration, the achievement gap was cut in half, right? Which is the biggest improvement by far we've seen in America's history. Okay, so No Child Left Behind was designed to improve low-income schools, but it actually put them at a severe risk of closing if they failed to meet almost impossible progress goals. I can talk about why they were impossible if people have questions. So as a response, the schools serving low-income students of color have been forced to teach to the test constantly. These tests are usually cheap and low quality. They're not really, they're not testing kids' intellectual ability, they're testing kids' ability to memorize things and do worksheets, right? And tied to this pedagogical strategy is a disciplinary strategy, right? So students who struggle behaviorally or academically threaten the school's tests after this, so they're wrongly counseled into special education, they're suspended or expelled, or told not to show up on the day of the test, or they're just neglected by teachers who have to pay attention to the kids who are just below proficiency, and actually ignore both the high-achieving and the low-achieving students in their classroom. Hence the rise of no excuses discipline, which is, when we keep when students are told how to walk the talk and where their eyes must be at every moment. So everyone whose eyes aren't at me, you just gotta demerit, right? That kind of thing. These schools have suspension rates of up to 70%. So 70% of students each year are suspended. In high schools, sometimes a third of the kids who enter will graduate, right? So we're seeing this problem of when your averages are what matter, you push the kids who aren't doing well out. And where do they go? They go to disciplinary alternative programs that funnel them into juvenile detention centers. Okay, so the only way to prevent this kind of racialized pedagogy in this new era of accountability is to abandon the separate but equal strategy that the Bush and Obama administrations have pursued. So lots of you might be asking, what about voluntary integration schemes? I want to clarify that the difference between voluntary and mandatory integration is basically that in voluntary integration schemes, parents, including white parents, choose to send their kids to those schools, right? So we're talking about, in New Haven, there are school lotteries, right? Where parents, there are considerations based on neighborhood to make it racially equal, but parents choose to send those kids to those schools. Magnet schools are another way that people do this. The problem with that, there are two problems with that. So first, the speaker mentioned parents involved, a Supreme Court decision that makes it difficult to use race. So if you want to achieve racial diversity, you have to rely on proxies, right? So they use socioeconomic status, neighborhood. The problem is that obviously relies on preserving residential segregation, right? So if you're relying on a neighborhood to tell you someone's race, it means you rely on that neighborhood continuing to be racially isolated. The other problem is that when you're voluntary integration programs are constantly catering to the people who have the most options instead of the people who need the most resources, right? So in New Haven's choice system, 2/3 of the city's limited preschool spots go to white affluent parents from the suburbs because they're trying to get them to stay in the New Haven public schools instead of to the people who actually can't afford to send their kids to preschool, and the same kind of power dynamics get reproduced in the schools. I'll yield to questions in a second. I'll just start by saying that the only way you're really going to do this is by redrawing district lines and school attendance zones so that every single school is integrated, so that parents can't pull their kids out of schools. And you have to do this including cities and suburbs so that white parents can't. What this basically amounts to is like, I disagree with the previous speaker. We actually just can't tolerate white parents' prejudice. And like that's extremely politically unpopular. But if you care about giving kids a fair chance and a fair opportunity to have a decent life, then white parents' prejudice has to go. Thanks.
Questions? Actually, Ms. Collier. Okay, thank you, Madam Senator. This is, I guess, an incident related to integration, but does Mr. Lafley think that evaluating student performance, school performance has an important role for the policy? And are there any methodologies that she would recommend that could be used to make sure that schools are actually meeting the needs of their students without creating perverse infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing is like, what we have right now is like state tests, city tests, like basically kids take a ton of tests, and the more tests you take, schools are only going to spend a certain amount of money on tests, so each of the tests are going to be cheaper, right, which means they're going to be lower quality. So some of this is just less testing that's better, right, and then it actually tells you something. Some of it is that, yes, it has a role to play. That role shouldn't be like, I mean, what No Child Left Behind did was say if 100% of your students are not proficient in 13 years, like, too bad. And if you were not on your way to meeting that goal within 3 or 4 years, you were gonna be close, right? So, I mean, that was like a pipe dream fantasy. That's like saying there'll be no crime in 13 years, right? And then we'll shut down police departments if you don't meet that goal, right? It's bizarre, right? So, I mean, there's obviously a role for it. It's just not, if you fail to meet a bizarre standard, then we're gonna shut you down because that obviously really negatively affects the schools that are trying to complete the school.
Further questions? The very excited Mr. Chuck.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I disagree with a lot of what Mr. Ruffley said, but I'm speaking after results. Okay, I'm going to talk about the thing I agree with her on. No Child Left Behind is really bad. It's really bad. It's really harmful for schools. But her conclusion was we can't use educational policy to solve the problems of racial inequality in schools because this particular one didn't work. It sounds like if we just get rid of No Child Left Behind, we'll solve a lot of these problems. Why does she think that's not the case?
Okay, so the problem is that No Child Left Behind was like, without school integration, there's a giant achievement gap. What do we do, right? And their only solution was like, we'll hold all these schools to the same standards, and then they'll magically meet the standards. I mean, obviously, you could do massive redistribution. I think if you did massive redistribution, you would probably get integrated schools, quite frankly. And if you integrated the schools, you get pretty significant redistribution. So I don't see, those two policies to my mind are pretty linked. Again, integration is the single most effective policy that has been tried in American history in terms of cutting the achievement gap. No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top or the Every Student Succeeds Act simply have not made sufficient or even significant progress towards that goal.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Instead of redrawing district lines to try and integrate schools that way, what about getting rid of zoning laws so that it's very easy to just move into the school district where you want your child to go?
Obviously solving the housing segregation problem is a far more straightforward path to solving the school integration problem. In terms of actually getting the results you want. The problem is that, the reason school integration is promising is that the government has a lot more control over its schools than it does over where you buy your house most of the time. Or same thing with building more low-income housing in suburban neighborhoods. Like, suburban communities rarely take that initiative, and they are also the ones who are most fervently acting in state legislatures against school integration schemes, mandatory or voluntary. So it's politically difficult, and that's why I think it has to come from a state level and be imposed. It's just not going to happen in a way.
All right, and with that, Mr. Howe can leave.
Okay, so I want to address the cultural question before I get to the educational question. I actually think that it can be good for people to, be able to live where they want, live around people with similar values to them, live around people who have the same culture as them, live around people who have the same experiences as them. I'm not going to talk about the white upper middle class because they largely are decadent and, generally I don't like their values. Which, why would we want to subject the poor and the oppressed minorities to decadence and terribleness? But that aside, I actually think that you will find that people can build really vibrant communities and cultures based upon who they live by. And we can find this to be really useful in, for example, low-income African American communities build great, have great communities surrounding churches, surrounding a sort of communitarianism that's very similar to the Amish, which I like. There are very good things which can happen from people with similar values living together. All right, so we covered that. It is worth pointing out that there are some communities which are not so great for whatever reason. High crime, decadence happening. And it would be easy to make the case that it would be good to allow students and children to get out of these situations, to go to schools, away from the high crime districts, away from their decadence, whatever. But I think Mr. Harris, wherever he is, made a really good point. They go to these schools which are outside of their communities, but then they come back. And they can't really escape the communities they live in, the values they grew up in, this sort of thing. But I also just think it's not particularly, it's not the most effective solution to education. Ms. Truffley took down No Child Left Behind far better than I would have. And she's exactly right, that's a really terrible policy. As she said, when you tell schools which are underfunded, low-income schools, where students have much higher barriers to achievement than, the affluent prep school in the Gold Coast of Chicago, hey, you need to achieve like the affluent school in the Gold Coast of Chicago, or we'll cut your funding. How does that make any sense? It makes no sense. Right, so we should get rid of No Child Left Behind. And the other thing we should get rid of are teachers' unions. Yes! Because teachers' unions protect bad teachers. This has been the case. I also agree with our esteemed guest, I agree with our esteemed guest that this funding disparity is a problem. But when we do have budget cuts in schools, as we often do, it's the young teachers, the excited teachers, the teachers who are fresh from college, and all these great new ideas who are fired because they cannot fire the old teachers because they have tenure. We should, I'll be a little libertarian here, we should allow the market to dictate which teachers are employed, which teachers are not. I think I'll yield to questions now. I'm sure there will be many.
All right, the new libertarian questions. Mr. Peck.
So, I have a big problem with this whole thing again about how really undiverse, homogenous communities can form sparkling examples of great culture. Isn't the problem with this that when you have really undiverse communities, part of this community's reason for being is based on oppression and exclusion, right? aren't the communities and the cultures that formed from the white suburbs that came after white flight, like, these are directly connected to racism and legacies of oppression. So why should we be really happy about the cultures that spring from these diverse areas?
If Mr. Peck would like to, send a bunch of rich whiteys to Puerto Rico so that it's diverse, because a bunch of rich white people will improve Puerto Rico, and he's welcome to do so. I'm not saying, I'm saying that similar values can create good cultures, but those good cultures should then go out into the marketplace and interact with other people. I am specifically, especially, actually, I'm glad you brought this up, because I do want to notice this. When we expose children who are not quite secure in their cultural identity to a maelstrom of culture, in their urge to fit in their urge to belong, they will discard a lot of really important elements of their culture. We have seen this time and time again.
Further questions? Thank you. I'm curious as to whether Mr. Trump can speak to the importance of historically black colleges in the American experience, and particularly in the African American community.
I'm probably not the most qualified to talk about that. I can say that I have, this will be all hearsay, but I've heard that, in fact, it was, especially when in this sort of sticky period when segregation was still, you're still trying to stamp it out, historically black colleges played a really important role in giving black men and women opportunities for higher education, for preserving a sense of their culture, really. Like, Yale University pre-segregation had a very distinct culture and was very white. Sending people who were not of this sort of affluent coastal elite class to Yale would just make them more coastal elite. It wouldn't allow them to create this new subset. It is essentially saying white coastal elite is how we must be. It's a little bit of respectability politics. And this is, I know, not being the left flags. I'm surprised they were dissing me when I said respectability politics were bad. But yeah, it is quite important to have space.
Further questions? For final question. Thank you. So, at this point, probably everyone in this room has heard this, but I grew up next to Cleveland Heights High School, one of the worst schools in the country, full of mishandled funds. This is an inner city school that the state government and local government tried to solve by throwing money at the problem. And it really, really didn't work. Part of it was because of teachers' unions, of course, but part of it was because the money was just very clearly mishandled and used to do all the wrong things. If funding is the answer, how can this be avoided?
Ms. Murphy raises a good point. A lot of what is truly unfortunate about community organization of schools, there's a lot that's good about it. But what's truly unfortunate is that often you have, especially in elected school boards, people who do not know much about education making decisions about really important educational policy for the school districts. And often you have a lot of corruption. And this is, really kind of bad. I'm trying to find a way around this that it seems like the only real way around this is to have appointments from above, but even they don't really know what's good. Indiana elected a superintendent of education for the state whose only qualification was being an elementary school librarian. I know my school district has elected many football coaches as president of the school board. I mean, we're just going to run into problems. There's no really good solution here, I don't think, that doesn't end with fascism.
And with that, the gentleman is clear the aisle so that speakers can approach. Can you just not sit there? Yeah. All right, so you made one really important point, which is that I try to think of an education system in history that has not managed to replicate and enforce the values and norms of the elite in a given society, and it's not coming. And this is a huge problem. I don't think there's a way to separate the values and norms of education rewards from what is considered successful or high class or whatever. in a group. I don't have a good solution for this, but I really want to push back on this idea that cultural values can function in a way that can, with any accuracy, be modeled as a marketplace. It's not like people are shopping around for ideas, and when they find one that they think is more true, they just maybe in some cases this is a model for individual behavior. I think this is the case for individuals who already exist in societies that have norms that are go and explore the world and figure out what works best for you and then adopt it, which is already a very restricted set of social groupings. Most people are tied to the culture and the values that they grew up with by a combination of economic factors, social factors, comfort, familiarity, access, the fact that those values themselves are sticky and reward sticky and reward staying in the same system. And there's also, they also determine what is and is not valuable. It's not a market where there's one fundamental commodity like money that everyone is exchanging. It's whether or not even happiness is important, or duty, or success, or impressiveness, or whatever. It's also dictated by your values. The general point that I'm trying to make here is this is an extremely complicated issue. I don't think this kind of model, this is how education policy should be modeled. More things, but I'm just talking now. Great, is there a question from Mr. Trump?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Okay. So I know the chairman of the Independent Party thinks that Judaism is a really important part of the public.
That's correct.
Okay, good. I'm right so far. I wonder if she is not concerned. I may have not done a very good job articulating
On
this.
personal privilege.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm having trouble hearing this.
All right. Can we have some order? All right.
Right. Mea culpa if I didn't explain this very well, but I do think, especially as children are forming their identities, it is important for them to be, maybe not all the time, but often around people who have the values, especially that their parents are going to bring them up with as important. And it could be racism, which is bad, but it could also be like Judaism, which is good. Or Judaism is good. Can Ms. Collier explain how we can keep the good values, especially the good minority values, or the good not widely subscribed values like Judaism, strong while also weakening racism, which is bad?
Okay, I have a lot of opinions on this, so I will try to be brief. So there are Jewish communities that work very hard to make sure that their children are not exposed to outside values. They have schools that are only led by Jews. Sometimes they make those kids only learn Yiddish so that they cannot be exposed to the sinful atheist Christian world. This is terrible, and these communities are almost always really abusive. And generally you can track the level of the degree to which Judaism is used as an excuse to coerce and manipulate by the extent to which it tries to limit contact with the outside world. They pretty much exactly correlate. I think that if values are good, then they are good irrespective of whether or not they are attractive in a lot of ways. The values can hurt people, but parents can certainly do their best to teach children their values and to expose them to positive instantiations of those values, but I think when parents turn that into isolating children from other perspectives, they are almost always doing a great disservice, and it's almost always a sign that something else is terribly wrong